I'm Nicole.
And I'm Jackie.
And this is Ghost to Coast.
Welcome to our Halloween episode.
It's Halloween.
And with us today, we have our good friend, Brittany Bernardi.
Yay!
From New York. And she is going to tell us all about the Salem witch trials today.
Well, I'm super excited to be here. I kind of talked to you all a lot about this, that I'm in a museum studies program, and spent a lot of time about last year thinking about the Salem witch trials and reading about the Salem witch trials. So I'm excited to kind of get this chance to talk about all of my thoughts, because it is really one of my favorite things to talk about. If I were ever to think about like a PhD program, that I think that, you know, this triangle of like historic sites and tourism and the paranormal is like so interesting to me. And like,
yeah,
that like as I was like putting together notes about this, like also thinking a little bit about like Sleepy Hollow and like what does like this kind of approach like mean in a space like Sleepy Hollow, where like that wasn't the name of the town. Like they like kind of triangulated where Sleepy Hollow would have been from Washington Irving's book and renamed the town. Washington Irving's book like was kind of based on a true story, kind of.
Right.
And that, like, now there's, like, a physical space that is Sleepy Hollow.
Yeah.
Tell us all you know about Salem, because I feel like my knowledge of the Salem witch trials is, like, obviously all this kind of, like, fictionalized things from movies and TV shows and stuff, and then, like, The Crucible.
Yeah.
Because it's like when they were teaching us the Salem witch trials in school, like I think in high school is when I learned about the witch trials, they used The Crucible as the text to teach us, and that's a play.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we really weren't learning about like the historical events. We were just kind of learning about the play, and it's not accurate.
Which, yeah, I think that, you know, it's a really interesting point, and it's a lot of kind of what I, like, ended up landing on, you know, talking about more and more, was this idea of, you know, what do we actually know about the Salem witch trials, because our, like, narrative of it has gotten so blurred with pieces of fiction, and you know, that when we talk about the Salem witch trials, a lot of what we're talking about is things like The Crucible and earlier literature that fictionalized what happened.
Mm-hmm.
When, like, I'm having to, like, kind of start at the very kind of basics, the very start of, you know, in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts, 24 people were put to death for witchcraft, and you know, several hundred people were accused of witchcraft, and, you know, what is happening to create this situation, and that you know, it was happening at a time where this wasn't the only witch trial. Like, this was happening primarily across Europe in much larger ways too, that, like, kind of in the scale of things, Salem was kind of small compared to what was happening in Europe, but that because it was smaller and you know, in a lot of ways because it was here, that we actually have a lot of kind of record, and we have a good idea of what was creating this situation. And it was, you know, a lot of pieces that, like, collapsed onto each other to, you know, breed a situation where this was able to happen. And I think, like, you know, at like a very kind of core, like, starting level, this was a very, very deeply religious space, and that you know, it's tough to, like, convey this in a way that, like, really, like, gets across the point of it, that, like, when something went wrong for these people in their lives, that was happening because they weren't good Puritans, and that was happening because the devil was holding them accountable to the ways that they weren't good Puritans, and like that pretty like your corn didn't grow and your porridge came out shitty, like all of that was because of the devil. Like everything was because of the devil.
Oh, okay.
And like I feel like it's tough for me to like explain like how very real that was to all of them, that like I feel like we have like a relationship with religion now where like that connection isn't quite so literal.
Right.
Right.
Where for them it was.
But you know, when you have when you have these like when you don't know things, when you don't know the science,
Right.
when your beliefs are made solely on these like folk beliefs, which like I believe you can call religion also a folk belief in some aspects.
Yeah.
You like think that this is truth.
Yeah.
You come up with reasons because everything has to happen for a reason. Right? And I think a part of me thinks that that's beautiful, and then a part of me thinks that's so sad. That you have to think that there's always a reason behind something happening.
Right. And so like then like you layer on also like that like their world was changing, and that like, you know, there were other religious groups coming into Massachusetts, and like there were Native people in Massachusetts that were like getting into fights with the Puritans, and you know these are problems in their community that are happening, and when there's a problem, it's because of the devil. So like these were really big, like changing their culture and changing their way of life, and that when things like that happen, it was like, oh, Satan's here. Like this, if other people have rights and like other people like have a claim to this land, it's because of Satan. Like and then, you know, that like I think like a lot of spaces and like a lot of, you know, cities and you know, places where people live, that there were, you know, wealthy parts of Salem and there were very poor parts of Salem, and that like there was also an interpersonal conflict between people, which then, you know, when every problem you have in your community, you're like, well, this is happening because of Satan, like this is happening because God's not protecting us from Satan, like that. Then, you know, the kind of normal disagreements you have with your neighbor, it starts opening that door. It starts creating the opportunity to say, like, I'm mad at Goody
Proctor.
Goody Proctor, and she stepped on my tulips because she's a witch. And then, you know, kind of what I kind of presented as like the last catalyst of this, of like what's created this situation, that Salem was, you know, kind of in this period of time where they were lacking a lot of structures of formal government. And so they were able to put into place like a lot of like temporary courts and temporary judges, because they were waiting on like the actual person who was supposed to be in charge of them to come from England. And like at this time, like communication's really bad. Like we don't have the ease of communication that we have now. Like it takes a long ass time for somebody to get from England to Massachusetts. And so like that was a chunk of time that they did not have somebody like with actual authority to tell them what they were supposed to do. Which is then how you end up with court cases that had supernatural evidence in them, and like that these were temporary courts with very unclear rules. So they like were putting like she flew around the courtroom and did all sorts of witch things, and a bunch of bats like came and followed her, like. And so that they were also like really quick to convict, that they were, you know, they didn't have any oversight on them, once it started happening of like, yeah, all of these people are witches, it turned into this fervor of everybody being like, yes, this is true, and let's just kind of crank these out. And like, they saw a ton of cases, they convicted a ton of cases.
It sounds like kind of how it snowballed, like mass hysteria kind of thing.
Right. And like that, I think like from there, what gets really interesting about this is like, you know, the way that we then project this story that like had like, you know, had real catalysts that like we can identify and we can say like we know how to like prevent this.
Mm-hmm.
But that it becomes this stand-in in like the American story of like what happens when prejudice runs out of control, and like what happens when prejudice runs without accountability. And so like then it does get like talked about in this idea of just like different cases of like mass hysteria, and like I think a lot about like, you know, the Satanic Panic, or like I had another example of this and now I'm trying to remember what. Oh, the McCarthyism, like the Red Hunt.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That like it. I think it's troubling the way that we like talk about it is like, oh, like this is just mass hysteria, when like no, like in all of these instances where something like this happens, there are catalysts, there are reasons why it's happening, and like
Right.
ways to like approach those so that like they don't happen again.
Mm-hmm.
And that like instead we just like land on like they all went crazy. Everybody in Salem just went crazy for a little while.
So then what was the catalyst specifically for the events here in America? Like, I know you said it was kind of happening all across Europe, but was there like a specific event that triggered the witch trials here?
So I mean, I think that, you know, so much of it like kind of comes back to like this group of young women in Salem, that they were you know, teenagers that were making a lot of the accusations, and like were, you know, the ones in the courtroom like having fits and being like, oh, she bit me with her supernatural like forces, and that I read something like really kind of interesting that resonated a lot with me of like, what does it look like, you know, from a mental and an emotional standpoint, to be a young woman living in a space like this.
Mm-hmm.
And like, you know, the way we talk about like teenage rebellion now and for us,
Right.
that like, who's to say that these girls didn't feel that way too, and that like they were growing up in like a very, very religious, very constrictive, like they did not have any kind of space for self-expression.
Right.
And that, you know, when one of them starts doing this, and one of them starts, you know, having this like rebellious moment of like, I'm the victim of witchcraft, and that, you know, the others see that happening and are like, oh, like I could do this too.
Mm-hmm.
And like, to what extent then is that like, is them, you know, being manipulative? Is that them not knowing that they're being manipulative? Is that like
Right.
you know, is it, you know, in any way like a almost like a mental breakdown of like being like, I'm going to express these rebellious feelings in like a way that I feel safe to do it, because everybody in town is saying like, you're right, and this is happening to you.
Right.
And like, it's okay for you to be like acting out in this way that it never would have been okay for you to be acting out before. That like you're matching that religious fervor to be able to come in and say, like, yes, and it's happening to me, and now I get to, like, break out of this shell that I have been in my whole life that, like, prevents me from doing anything like this.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, like, women didn't have a lot of validation at that point in time. Like, everything was run by men, I'm assuming?
Yeah. Like, women didn't have a lot of freedom, and women, like...
Women were property at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But I'm also at this point where I'm like, these girls also saw what was happening as a result of their, whatever you want to call it, and continued.
Yeah. And then, like, also that, like, going back to that idea of that this was their culture, was to place blame on the supernatural when something went wrong.
Sure.
That, like, in a lot of small ways throughout their whole life, they had seen, like, it is okay to blame, like, the influence of the devil on why something is happening, and that, like, they might not have seen it as necessarily, like, bad to be, like, pointing the finger in this way, but, like, yeah, that also, like, you're having a really serious, like, consequence. Like, there are people died, Susan. Like,
many people died.
Many people died.
It feels like there's, like, these two dichotomies happening where it's like these young women are trying to find some way to hang on to self-expression, like you said, or some kind of, like, validity, feeling validated by the people around them. And then also, like, just in some cases feels like carelessness because people are, or ignorance because people are dying, and there doesn't seem to be any remorse for the consequences.
Right.
Like you were saying that they, like, were so quick to blame the devil. I feel like it gives them a scapegoat to escape responsibility of what they were doing.
Right. Yeah. And, like, exactly that it doesn't seem like they really took much accountability for the results of their actions, but also everybody around them that, like, had managed to, like, avoid accusation in this, like, we're all looking at this situation and saying, like, yep, we're just doing what we have to do to excise the devil from our community, which, like, is just, like, that's not what is happening here, though. Like, these are... And I think, like, a really interesting point to bring up, too, is that, like, for the most part, the people who were put to death were the ones who refused to admit guilt. Like, the ones who maintained that they were not witches and they didn't do this, like, were the ones that were put to death.
Right.
And that people who were willing to say, like, yes, I'm a witch, and I have done the things you say that I've done, were put into jail and were later pardoned and let out.
Yeah, I guess that was my next question. Like, if there were...
If they didn't die in jail.
If they didn't die in jail. There were a few that died in jail, too.
Sure. Yeah, I guess my next question was, like, if there were any records of what the accused people were saying or, like, trying to do to defend themselves, like, and if any of that worked.
Yeah, and like, I'll admit that, like, a lot of, like, what I ended up writing about was a lot of, like, historical tourism and, like, what, you know, particularly, like, the influence of the witch trials is on, like, the lasting legacy of Salem, Massachusetts. And so, like, I would like to get a little deeper into, like, you know, trial information, but what I think is really, like, cool about this is, like, that this is such a dramatic example of, like, bias in primary sources, and that, like, there is, you know, a ton of court records from this time, and a lot of, you know, records that we still have from, like, from the witch trials that, like, you know, as a reasonable, rational person, you could look at and be like, I know that nobody flew out of the courtroom. I know this to be true.
Or
like,
did they?
Right. And I mean, like anything in history too, that like, you know, history gets written and preserved by people in power and people that have the most, you know, control over the way they get remembered. And so like it's
History is written by the winners.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, like so many of them, and you know, I think then it starts getting into this idea of like Salem today, and you know, this whole like we're the daughters of witches you couldn't burn, that like these were people who super did not want to be thought of as witches. These are people that this was really, you know, the worst accusation you could make against them, and that
Yeah, that I feel like that phrase always felt kind of weird to me. Like, daughters of the witches we couldn't burn, because it feels like it is disregarding the actual events of what happened. And how a lot of these people accused were innocent of doing anything. Because it was all, it seemed very much like it was mostly hearsay, what was happening.
Yeah. And that, like, I mean, I love, like, books and stories about, like, witches, and I'm really interested in, like, kind of the modern presence of, like, people who have adopted this identity of
Sure.
being witches and what that means for them. But that, like, there is a big part of it that feels, you know, kind of disrespectful in a lot of ways, like,
yeah,
that and there's like a like kind of controversial, you know, figures within the Salem community who are like, well, this is what they would have wanted for us. It's like, I don't think that. I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, I like, you all know that, like, I'm into that kind of, like, witchcraft, spiritual kind of connecting to the elements, if you will. But for me, none of that has to do with, like, tracing my roots back to, like, this specific woman who was, like, put to death in the Salem witch trials. Like, there's, like, a long lineage of witches. Because, like you said, it feels, like, disrespectful to the memories of these people who died during that time that, like, we would capitalize on that. And I guess that's also why Salem itself has become so fascinating, like you said. Like, it's capitalizing on the, like, tourism trap of the Salem witch trials.
Right. And that, like,
which in and of itself is capitalizing on the deaths of other people.
Yeah.
And I talk about it in the essay that I'd written, of that the last of the like Salem, like people who were killed as witches, the last of them was memorialized in a big event that took place on Halloween. And that, like, that feels very, like, kind of tongue-in-cheek and very, like, we're still trying to, like, insert this, like, spookiness,
make it into like a holiday thing.
Yeah.
Do you know what time the Salem witch trials were happening? Like, time of the year?
Yeah, it was 1692.
But was it like an entire year, right?
Yeah, it started in February of 1692, went until May of 1693.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a long bit of time.
Yeah, so it wasn't just, like, one instance that happened on Halloween that we all think it is.
No.
And then the Sanderson sisters come back, and
like, that's what's so, like, crazy about, so Salem 1692. You know, like a lot of kind of locations and maps change over time. There's all sorts of reasons why that happens. So Salem, as it was thought of then, is now Danvers. Like, a lot of the historic sites that actually happened during the witch trials were not in modern day Salem. And so, like, which, like, you know, advice for people that, like, want to visit Salem because they have an interest in, like, the historic, you know, information about this space. You should go to Danvers. You should at least spend some time in Danvers rather than going to Salem, because, like, all of the structures there, while there are, like, I think, like, one or two that actually date back to the time of the trials, it wasn't where it happened. And so, like, there are all sorts of, like, kind of tourist traps that have come up in Salem that are, like, the Boris Karloff mansion and, like, some kind of, like, pirate ship thing. And, like, that there are, you know, a ton of, like, you know, museums, big quotation marks, that have absolutely nothing to do with, like, the witch trials, but are, like, capitalizing on this just being, like, come on down to, like, year-round Halloween place.
Right, yeah. It seems like Salem, modern day Salem, has just become, like, Halloween town.
Yeah.
Which actually exists in Oregon.
Yeah. Halloween town.
We got that.
Right? But, like, I mean, if I were to go to Salem, because I'd love to visit Salem,
I want to go too. Yeah.
I would want to go to Danvers and learn about, like, the actual historical events. Because that feels more, one, true to history, two, more respectful of all these people that, like, went through this turmoil, most of them being innocent of anything. Like, to actually learn their history. And that's what I love to do as a person, is just, like, rooting through history and finding out, like, the facts of things. And that's what I would want to do if I was to go to Salem. I'd, like, avoid the tourist traps. Because
I'd go to the tourist. I'm a little goblin queen. I want to go. But, like, yeah, that it, like, you hear all of these accounts of people that are like, yeah, I thought I would go and learn something, and I didn't. I super didn't.
Yeah. Like, I want to learn.
That, like, there's a big conflict between, like, the tourism industry and, like, Salem's historic sites, where like, there are, like, reputable museums in Salem that refuse to talk about the witch trials at all because of the way that, like, the tourism industry has commercialized this story. And so, like, they will really actively be like, we are not going to talk about it. We're not going to put up displays about it. Like, if you want to come here, we're going to, like, talk about Salem's maritime history and, like, everything else that's happened here. And I remember reading this whole account from a woman who, like, went because she was, like, doing historical research into the witch trials, and, like, just all of the hoops that she had to jump through to, like, figure out where the court documents were. Like, that she had, she had to, like fill out all sorts of paperwork, and like was taken, like, into, like, a back room somewhere because, like, there's a museum in Salem that, like, has all of this and, like, keeps it, like, deep in their archives and doesn't want to show anybody.
Right. Well, I'm sure it's like, if I was a historian in Salem, I would be exhausted by the tourists just coming in and being like, oh, we're witches, and just like, it's spooky Halloween time, and like, just like,
I don't know. I think there's also a way to talk about it without just not talking about it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if not talking about it is the best way to go about things, because I'm sort of in my mind equating the situation to the Holocaust and how Germany has taken full accountability of what's happened, whereas it feels like the historic society
has just said, I'm washing my hands of this.
Has just said,
no.
we're not engaged.
Right. Yeah. And
which I don't know if that's the best route
to
take.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely can see where that's true. It's like, yes, I said that they're probably exhausted, and that's probably true, but at the same time, like, I think knowledge is important and knowledge is necessary in order to gain and establish respect for the people that went through these historical events and the historical events themselves.
Right.
So
and traumatic events.
Yeah.
Honestly, if we want to talk about like human history and empathy, like this is a
huge.
This was a trauma.
Oh,
that everybody went through.
Absolutely, 100%.
In that town at this time, throughout this year, and beyond. Like, I'm sure people got super fucked up by the entire thing.
Like, I think about like the like surviving family members of the people who were executed during the witch trials. Like,
100%.
What you have to like go through, like, you know, having lived with this person for however long that you did, and if they were innocent, knowing that like they did nothing wrong, but they were killed because some people decided that they were gonna use them as a scapegoat, and like you have to just live with that, and that's awful. Like that, the grief that you have to feel for the rest of your life, like about your loved one, and the fact that like they were probably still in that community. They probably didn't leave that community.
Yeah.
So it's like they were suddenly like outcast because they're related to this person. I'm assuming that's probably what would have happened.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It was, you know, a blight on the rest of your life was you were a part of this witch family. And like, I think, you know, I agree. I think like for spaces like this that and there are a lot of spaces across the US where, you know, historical tourism has really shaped the historical narrative and you know, often creating falsehoods in doing that, and that I think, you know, I would much rather these reputable museums step in and say like we're going to have a like frank, realistic discussion of like what happened here and what it means. But that, you know, this is now the, like, primary revenue source for the city of Salem.
Oh,
like,
yeah, sure.
That this whole city now depends on being the witch city and what the tourism that draws allows them to maintain. And you know, that's, I think, what's really interesting about historical tourism for me is that it becomes like, it's like this, and we kind of can't fix it.
Yeah.
And it, like, takes so much voice away from the people that live there today and how they are able to, you know, shape their community and shape their own narrative when, you know, everybody is, you know, just coming in for a weekend to utilize their space. Like that it becomes so messy of like, how do you fix something like this when everybody relies on it for the entire infrastructure of the city?
I also think that it would be remiss to have this conversation without talking about some of the people who died and why they died. Like, Tituba is a huge part of anytime I think about the Salem witch trials, I think about Tituba. And this is a slave woman.
And I can't talk about Tituba for a million years.
Please talk about her, because I just want everybody to know about her, because it makes me so sad. And I'm like, this is a Black woman who did not have any relation to the Puritan religion.
I love talking about Tituba. I love talking about Tituba. Because, like, I think also in this idea of, like, how historical narratives change over time, that it wasn't really until, like, the time of the Civil War that we really started to, like, reframe Tituba as being a catalyst of the Salem witch trials, and that people really started to blame Tituba as, you know, the person who introduced witchcraft into Salem.
Sure.
And that it wasn't really until the time of the Civil War that we started to see references to Tituba being black, that, like, Tituba was thought of primarily as an Indian woman prior to the time of the Civil War. And that, like, yeah, that I think Tituba is such an interesting, like, character in this whole story of what happened, and that, you know, is so much of a victim alongside everybody else. And I think, you know, far less than anybody else does she get thought of as a victim. I think she is often thought of as, like, the one person who was actually practicing witchcraft, and I don't think that was true.
No, I see her as a victim in all of this. Because it's like, of course you are going to blame the woman who has no family, who is a person of color, who doesn't have a relation to this religion that is part of this community. I think that that's also an important conversation to have, is that a lot of these people who died, who were blamed and called out as witches, were, yes, of course, there were men who were also called out, but a lot of them were women,
were outspoken women, were
strong women in the community, but were also outside of the social norms.
Yeah. And, you know, also that, like, for, like, there were men that you can kind of trace that were these land disputes, were people using the kind of breakdown of the witch trials in order to, you know, do things for their own advantage and say, oh, well, that guy, he's a witch too, and if he gets, you know, killed as a witch, I get his land, and so it benefits me to do this. And that, yeah, it's you know, all of them, the people who died, the people who spent a year in prison because they, you know, were targeted in this way. I know that there's a story of a woman who, you know, had a child during the course of the witch trials, and that child was ultimately accused of witchcraft as well, and that, like, this is insane.
Just because it was her child?
Yeah.
Wow.
That both of them got accused. I will say, you know, Tituba, she was one of the people that was put into prison instead of being put to death. And that she, you know, was one of the people who confessed and then made a lot of accusations and took a lot of people down with her.
This is very true.
Wow.
Yeah. Which, you know, like, I think turns into, like, you know, that often when we talk about the Salem witch trials, we also talk about, like, the Red Scare and McCarthyism, and, like, that, you know, in
the more people you accuse, the more
leniency.
the less
attention on yourself.
Attention. I was gonna say blame, but the less attention on you. When, like, you're being accused of something that's gonna put you to death, is it a good thing to do? No, but Survival instinct.
Right. It's like you gotta think about what would you do if you were in that situation.
Yeah,
like
human survival instincts.
If there was literally no other option.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do? Like, then you really have to start thinking about, like, if you were in this situation, what would you do?
It's like, we can put ourselves in those kind of life or death situations all the time, but it's like, we have the answer that we want to say because we want to seem like a good person, but you never actually know until you're put into a situation how you're going to react.
And, like, how scary for, like, all of the people who did choose to confess, and, like, that conflict of, like, I think I could save myself. I think that, like, but that this is now always going to be, like, you get out of prison at the end of this. You get to go about your life. You don't know that at the time, but, like, you do. And now you continue to live in this very small town. These are the only people you're ever going to know. And they all, at least some part of them think you're a witch.
Yeah, this is your new identity, which is, I mean, terrifying. It's like, it's why people leave small towns, is because there's so much pressure to appear a certain way once people decide what your identity is for you.
What do you do, though, if you say that you are guilty of witchcraft and you continue to live in this religious community? What do you do? What did they do?
Right. Like, how
did they just continue to live? Did they have to do, like, atonement or, like, repentance or, like, anything like that?
As far as, like, my research that I had done, that, like, they kind of continued the whatever type of work they had done before, that they, it certainly, like, created wedges and that there was already a lot of, like, social turmoil between residents of Salem that this exasperated and it ended in 1693, but it kind of didn't. That there was, a lasting history, and I remember reading about, what did this look like for descendants of the Salem witch trials, and that a lot of descendants just didn't want any kind of discussion of this for, like, a very, very long time, that, like, you did not want to be associated with, like, what had happened, and you certainly didn't want like people coming to Salem like, ooh, this is where the witch trials happened, and that that lasted a longer than you'd think. Like, that, like, there were still kind of echoes of that, like, happening, 1800s, early 1900s, of, like, people who could trace their lineage being like, we're not a part of this. We are not going to be a part of this conversation. And I think, like, that, like, this fight for how we memorialize victims of the Salem witch trials, like, has, like, revealed a lot of people that, like, feel this sense of, like, oh, cool, we'll make it spooky. And when, like, there are people, and some of them descendants, who are like, no, I think we should just kind of do a memorial. Right. I think we should do this in a respectful way.
Right. Like, I love ghost stories, don't get me wrong. I love ghost stories. I want to find a ghost one day, but, like, we don't have to make everything a ghost story. Yeah, I think there's a balance that needs to be struck with the whole event of Salem witch trials. Like, part of it is spooky, but part of it is also, this was real life.
I want to talk about Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Who's Nathaniel Hawthorne?
Oh, Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Please talk about Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Yes, that Nathaniel Hawthorne was an American novelist in the 1800s, and he is a descendant of Judge John Hawthorne, who was the only one of the Salem judges who didn't repent, who never said he was wrong, who, like, went to his death being like, yep, I did the right thing in Salem during the witch trials.
Whoa.
And that Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a lot about the Salem witch trials and a lot of kind of very, like, pointed, like, this was an objectively bad thing that happened, and, like, this idea of, like, his legacy as, like, a part of, like, what happened, that, like, I think that what his work did, like, is really interesting by, you know, being able to be a part of this narrative and, like, to give it that context of, like, it shouldn't have happened this way.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even know that.
I don't know if this is what y'all do, but I figured that I would do it. That a huge resource for me in this was a book called The Salem Witch Hunt by a man named Godbeer. Quite a name. Would also as, like, a kind of easier read. There's a book called The Witches that is also just fantastic, a little less academic than anything else that I read for the work that I was doing, but it goes into a lot of, like, kind of the way that court documentation was just, like, visibly wrong. Like, it's a, you know, just kind of like a deep dive all the way through the Salem witch trials.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I love reading, like, historical books, and just, like, books about history. So I feel like I'm reading those books more than I read fiction.
My brain got so busted in this last year and a half. I used to, like, only read nonfiction, and now I only read, like, thrillers for moms. Just mom thrillers.
I used to read so much, and now all I can read is fan fiction.
Yeah, I mean, that's the vibe.
It's, like, the only thing I can read because I don't have to put a lot of energy and brain space into new characters. It's like,
Right.
I know these characters. Put them in high school. Let's go.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Brittany, for sharing your knowledge on the Salem witch trials with us.
Yes, of course. I am so glad to have gotten to do this with you all. And I hope that it was fun edutainment.
Yes.
It was. And we hope to have you back for other episodes in the future.
Absolutely.
Yes. Let me know. You both know my passion for spooky history.
Yes.
And I love you both. I love you.
I love you.
And I love you. And I love you.
Yeah. And now that you know all of the, like, all of my hot takes on Salem's historical tourism industry, let's plan our sweet trip to Salem's historical tourism industry.
Okay, no,
Yeah.
but Jackie's 30th birthday is gonna be an entire event.
It's going to pop off.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Brittany, telling us all about the Salem witch trials. And we hope to see you again on Coast to Coast.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you. This was amazing.